My son said he was going to the cemetery to visit his father, so I secretly followed him to lay down some flowers. But when I arrived, the groundskeeper came up to me and quietly said, "Don't go to that grave. You need to see what he's really doing." 1 hour later. Hello, beloved listeners. Thank you for joining me today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I'm always curious to know which corners of the world you're tuning in from. Let me know your city in the comments. Enjoy the story. The dust in my apartment seems to lead a life of its own. I watch it swirling in the shafts of morning sunlight that pierce through the heavy velvet drapes. It spins in a slow, silent dance, settling on the spines of the books that fill every shelf, every floor-toseling rack. This isn't my library. This is the library of my late husband, and I am its curator. It's been 5 years since he passed. Today marks exactly 5 years. The apartment is his, too. Everything here breathes him, his habits, his greatness. His massive dark mahogany desk sits in the center of the living room, his armchair permanently indented after years of long academic work. My own little corner, a small writing desk near the window crowded with geranium pots, has long been covered by the same layer of dust as everything else. I haven't opened the drawer holding my tools, my former tools, in 30 years. The morning of the anniversary always drags by, thick like molasses. I brewed some tea and sat at the kitchen table. The mug in my hands was slightly warm, but the cold felt like it was radiating from deep inside. It's always like this when I'm waiting for my son Jabari and his wife Niara. The doorbell rang sharp like a gunshot in the library's hush. I knew it was them. They always show up on the anniversary, not out of grief, but because it's an opportunity to talk about money. Mama. Hey. Jabari's voice, loud and deliberately cheerful, burst into the hallway with. He gave me an awkward hug, his prickly cheeks scraping against mine. He smelled of expensive cologne and anxiety. Nara followed him in like a shadow. On her face was an expertly manufactured expression of sorrow. She gave a silent nod, gliding into the living room, her eyes immediately darting to the bookshelves. She'd never loved these books. Just collections she'd once muttered under her breath, thinking I didn't hear. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, heading into the kitchen. "We could really use something stronger, Ma." Jabari sighed, collapsing heavily into his father's armchair. He always did that, sat in Kwame's chair as if trying on a life that didn't fit him. Things are going from bad to worse. I poured the tea in silence. I knew this prelude by heart. Now would come the complaints about unreliable business partners, about customs duties that were choking them, about their vague import-export venture that seemed to bring nothing but debt. "That container is stuck at the port of Charleston. Can you believe it?" Nara cut in. Her voice was laced with carefully performed desperation. "And the merchandise is worth so much, like $200,000. We need to make an emergency deposit or we lose everything, all our investment." She looked straight at me, unflinching. The look of a predator calculating how much more could be squeezed from a useless old relative. "We didn't want to bother you, Ma, especially today." Jabari lowered his voice, feigning delicacy. "But the situation is critical. We need financial help." Nothing stirred inside. Before, I might have felt a pang of pity or guilt. But over the past 5 years, something had burned away. All that was left was dry, bitter ash. I looked at my 40-year-old son at his face, already etched with a net of wrinkles from constant dissatisfaction, and I didn't recognize the boy whose scraped knees I had once kissed better. "I'll think about it, Jabari," I replied quietly. "I need to check what I have." He pursed his lips in annoyance. Niara shot him a quick, angry glance. They had been counting on immediate consent, on that blind maternal love that forgives all and gives everything. Suddenly, Jabari stood up. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, exactly as his father used to do. But in him there was none of his father's stature, just a cheap. He stood like that for a minute, then turned. His eyes were moist. I knew this trick. He'd used it since childhood when he wanted something badly. 5 years, he said, his voice trembling. 5 years since Pop left, and I still feel like he's about to walk through that door. I am going to the cemetery. I need to sit there alone, talk to him. A single artfully deployed tear rolled down his cheek. Nara watched him with ill-concealed admiration. Now that's a winning move. And I fell. In that moment, all my knowledge of him, all the bitter experience of the last few years retreated. Somewhere deep inside, in that forgotten corner where hope still lived, a warmth stirred. What if? What if there really is something human left in him? What if the memory of his father isn't just an empty word? This thought was so welcome, so sweet that I clung to it like a drowning person to a straw. The hunger for sincerity, for any sign of a son's love, was stronger than common sense. That's good, Jabari, I whispered, and my voice genuinely trembled. That's very good. He nodded, wiping the tear, and quickly headed for the exit, as if afraid I might notice the deception. Nara stayed for another minute to seal the effect. He's taking it so hard, Miss Johnson, she cooed, using my late husband's surname. He loved his father so much. He just doesn't show it, she left. I was left alone in the deafening silence, broken only by the clock's ticking, and that warmth, that timid hope began to grow in me. I suddenly desperately wanted to see it, to see my son at his father's grave alone in silence and sorrow. Not to catch him or verify him, but to believe, to feel, even for a moment, that we were a family connected by shared memory. I quickly changed, taking 3 deep red carnations from the vase, the ones I'd bought that morning for Wayne's portrait. I called a cab to the next street over so they wouldn't spot me. The whole ride I imagined arriving standing hidden behind an old oak tree and seeing him, his head bowed at the family mausoleum. And maybe then I would find the strength to help him one last time. Pinage Cemetery greeted me with cool calm and the rustling of old trees. The air smelled of decaying leaves and tranquility. I walked along the familiar gravel path leading to our family crypt. My heart pounded with excitement, with hope. I could already see the massive granite gates of the mausoleum in the distance when a man tall and stooped in work clothes emerged from around a corner and walked toward me. It was Ephraim, the groundskeeper. He'd worked here for at least 10 years. Quam had once helped him either with housing or with work. I don't remember the details. I knew him by sight. We always exchanged silent nods, but today he didn't nod. He walked directly toward me, and there was something in his eyes that covered my hope with a crust of ice. His face, usually placid, now resembled a severe mask. He walked almost up to me. I stopped, clutching the carnations. "Miss Johnson," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but every word burrowed into my consciousness like a shard of glass. "Hello, Ephraim," I replied, trying to smile. "I'm going to see my husband, and my son is here somewhere." He interrupted me, placing his rough, calloused palm on my shoulder. I didn't feel it because at that moment he looked me straight in the eye and a chill ran down my spine. "Ava," he whispered so softly I barely heard. His face was tense and grim. "Don't go to the crypt, please. Not right now. Wait. You need to see what he's really doing." Ephraim's words didn't cause me fear or a desire to argue. They simply fell into the ringing void that had opened inside. The carnations in my hand suddenly felt alien, lifeless. I nodded silently. "I didn't ask why or what do you mean. I already knew I wouldn't like the answer." He turned and without looking back walked away from the main avenue along a barely visible path overgrown with weeds. I followed him like a sleepwalker. We walked in complete silence, the only sounds being the rustle of our steps on the dry leaves and the distant, mournful cry of a crow. He led me to a small hill, to an old leaning fence of some long-forgotten grave. From here, through the dense branches of wild lilac, our family crypt was visible as clear as day, somber, majestic, made of black granite. It seemed an unshakable monument to the honor and dignity of the Johnson lineage. "You can see everything from here and they can't see us," Ephraim said just as softly, then moved aside toward a tree, giving me space at the fence. He seemed to understand that this was something I had to see alone. I gripped the cold metal of the fence. I didn't have to wait long, less than 5 minutes. 2 figures appeared from the main avenue, Jabari and Niara. My son wasn't alone. He hadn't come to talk to his father. He'd brought his wife. They weren't carrying flowers. Their stride was businesslike, quick, no sorrow, no pause at the entrance to cross themselves or just stand in silence. Jabari pulled a set of keys from his pocket. He inserted one, large and antique, into the keyhole of the crypt's heavy wrought iron door. A loud grinding sound echoed through the cemetery silence. The door groaned open. They walked inside as if entering not a tomb, but a storage unit, an ordinary garage. Cold inside me, which had been only a premonition until then, began to gain density. It became solid, heavy. I watched, unable to look away, as if my eyelids were frozen to their sockets. A few more minutes passed. A third person approached the crypt. A man in a long, dark coat despite the relatively warm day. I couldn't see his face. He stayed in the shadows, but his entire figure radiated something unpleasant, slick. He didn't greet them. He just peeked inside and said something brief. And then I saw the movement. Jabari and Niara emerged, carrying objects in their hands, items carefully wrapped in dark velvet, one elongated, the other almost square. They handed them to the man. I didn't know what they were, but the way they did it, quickly, looking around nervously, said everything. The wind carried snippets of their conversation to me. Their voices were low but distinct in the dead silence. Flawless forgery, the stranger said, slightly lifting the edge of the velvet. A pro couldn't spot it. I told you the master wouldn't let us down, my son replied, a note of pride in his voice. This isn't cheap knockoff stuff. And the museum? Is everything smooth with the Atlanta Museum of Art? Nara asked. Her voice was sharp with greed. The museum director, old fool. He's desperate for this 15th century Psalter for his collection. Jabari chuckled. He'll swallow it whole and won't choke. The main thing is your people get the right documents to show it was a found treasure. And in that moment, something happened that changed everything forever. The warmth, that maternal warmth I had nurtured for 40 years. The one that made me forgive lies, cover debts, and believe in tears of repentance. That warmth didn't fade. It vanished instantly like a flash of lightning that turns a living tree into charred rock. In my chest, where the love for my son used to be, a block of ice formed. No, not ice. Something denser, heavier, compressed from disappointment and 40 years of foolishness. It wasn't even hatred. Hatred is a feeling. It requires energy. This was cold, crystalline clarity and boundless, heavy sorrow. They weren't just thieves. They were desecrators. They had turned his father's grave, my husband's crypt, into a fence's warehouse. Dedicated his entire life to the study of history, to the preservation of originals. He hated falsehood in all its forms, and his own son, his flesh and blood, used his ashes to cover up the trade of fate. It was sacrilege of such magnitude that my mind refused to fully grasp it. I didn't cry. There were no tears. They seemed to have frozen somewhere before reaching the surface. The man in the coat nodded, took the bundles, and vanished just as quickly. Jabari and Niara glanced inside one more time, adjusted something, and then with the same grating sound, they closed and locked the door and they left without laying a single flower. I don't remember saying goodbye to Ephraim. I think I just nodded at him and walked away. He said nothing, and I was grateful for that. I walked along the paths, past the crosses and obelisks, and saw nothing. I moved automatically, walked out the cemetery gates, caught a car, and gave my address. The whole way home, I stared out the window at the flashing houses, trees, and people, feeling as if I were inside a glass bell. The world existed somewhere outside, and I was here in a soundless, cold void. Entering the apartment, I stopped in the entryway. The air was permeated with the smell of books, old paper, and his tobacco, which seemed like it would never air out. I walked slowly into the living room, past his desk, past his armchair, past the rack stacked with the fruits of his life. All of it suddenly seemed like a set design, beautiful, majestic, but dead. My gaze fell upon my corner, the small writing desk near the window, cluttered with old receipts, my dusty, forgotten space. I approached it slowly, as if performing a ritual, drawing my finger across the dusty lid, then pulling out the bottom, deepest drawer. It yielded with difficulty, screeching. Inside, beneath a stack of timid papers, it lay a simple wooden box unadorned. I took it out. The tiny bronze key always hung on a chain around my neck beneath my clothes next to my cross. A reflexive habit left over from the days when the contents of this box were my life. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. Click. I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark green velvet, were my tools. They hadn't tarnished. A small yet powerful jeweler's loupe, a compact metal-cased ultraviolet lamp, a set of fine tweezers and scalpels. And beneath them, in a lower compartment, lay 3 thin hardcover volumes, my personal reference books which I had compiled back in graduate school, historical pigments and their chemical composition, watermarks 15th century to present, binding techniques of various eras. I picked up the loupe. The cold metal felt familiar in my palm. I lifted it to my eye and looked at my skin. Every line, every pore became visible with merciless clarity. For 30 years I hadn't used these tools. For 30 years I had been just a then a mother, then a widow, a keeper of someone else's memory. But today at the cemetery, something had died and something else long buried began to awaken. I carefully closed the box. I didn't wipe the dust from the writing desk. Tomorrow I would put things in order here. My order. The night passed without sleep. I didn't lie, looking at the ceiling or turn over old grievances in my memory. I sat in an armchair in silence and just stared at the toolbox which sat on my desk. I wasn't planning anything, not constructing schemes for revenge. I was simply allowing the cold clarity to fill me to the brim, pushing everything else out, like an old dusty vessel that has finally been emptied to be filled with something clean and transparent. I woke up with the first light. There was no haste, no familiar morning heaviness. I took a rag and a bucket of water, and for the first time in years began to tidy up my corner. I wiped the dust from the writing desk layer by layer until the texture of the old wood reappeared. I repotted the geraniums. I cleaned the glass on the small bookshelf that held my books, Natwami. They weren't great works, but modest monographs, collections of articles I had written before getting married. I looked at my name on the covers, Eva Jones, and felt like I was meeting a long-lost acquaintance. I didn't touch the rest of the apartment. Library, his desk, his armchair, all remained in their dusty memorial neglect. But my little corner by the window now shone with cleanliness. It was my staging ground. The doorbell rang precisely at noon. This time there wasn't a hint of yesterday's false sorrow. It was short, businesslike, impatient. They walked in without ceremony. Jabari didn't even try to hug me. His face was strained. Nara looked at me with ill-concealed irritation. Their visit had one single purpose. Wilma, did you think about it? Jabari asked right from the doorway, walking into the living room. Tea first? I replied in an even voice. They exchanged glances. Their eyes red. More of these old people's rituals, but they complied. They sat down, Jabari in his father's chair, Niara on the edge of the sofa, ready to jump up at any second. I went to the kitchen. My movements were slow and precise. I took out the tea leaves, poured boiling water, sliced a lemon. I could hear them talking in low voices in the living room. She's stalling, Niara hissed. Calm down. Where is she going to go? Jabari replied. She'll drink her tea and sign everything. I placed the tray with the cups on the table. The porcelain clinket, soft. I sat down opposite them in a simple wooden chair that usually stood in my kitchen. I did not sit in my usual place. I poured the tea. Jabari tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest. Niara picked up a cup but didn't take a sip. Ma, we don't have time for beating around the bush. Jabari began breaking the silence. We need an answer today. It's a large amount. We need to get it done before the banks close. I took a small sip. The tea was hot, tart. It burned my throat, but the cold remained inside. I looked up at them calmly without judgment, just looking at them like two strangers who had come to me on business. Jabari is your business. I began softly as if thinking aloud. Related to antiques, Jabari froze. His fingers stopped tapping. He looked at me in surprise. What? He asked. I was just remembering my old work. I continued just as calmly, looking into my cup. Rare books, manuscripts. I was curious what exactly you deal with. Import, export is so vague. A silence fell. 1 second, another. And then Jabari laughed loudly, boisterously. It was not a cheerful laugh. It was a laugh of superiority. The laugh of a person listening to a child's babbling. Ma, please, he said, catching his breath. Don't bore us with your old hobbies. What manuscripts? We're dealing with serious things. Logistics, supply chain. Do those words mean anything to you? What could you possibly know about any of this? Niara wasn't laughing. She wore a quiet, pitying smile. She reached across the table and patted my hand condescendingly. Her fingers were cold. Ms. Johnson, dear, she purred, you should be thinking about your health. Don't worry your head about things you don't understand. We'll handle all the details ourselves. She removed her hand and her gaze hardened, starting with the bank transfer. Jabari's right. We need to go. They stared at me, waiting. There was nothing in their eyes but greed and condescension. They saw before them a quiet, senile old woman who had suddenly indulged in a memory. They mistook my calm for apathy, my question for a sign of sility. They didn't see me. They only saw a wallet that was inexplicably slow to open. And in that moment, I understood that I possessed a weapon they didn't even suspect. Their own certainty of my nothing. I watched the light from the window fall on Niara's face, highlighting the harsh crease by her lips. I saw the vein twitching on Jabari's temple from impatience. I felt no pain from their words. I felt something inside me finally calibrating, adjusting like the optics in a precise instrument. I slowly placed the cup on the saucer. The sound seemed deafening again in the strained silence. "All right," I said. My voice was even, perhaps even too tired. "I understand you." The relief on their faces was almost palpable. Jabari leaned back in the chair. Niara allowed herself a short, triumphant smile. "I will need to review my assets," I added. Jabari immediately sat up straight. Of course, he nodded. "See what's in the accounts. Call the bank if you need to. We can wait for an hour." "No," I replied, "I need time. I'll do it alone." I stood up, indicating that the conversation was over. They were displeased by the delay, but confident in the result. They left, throwing instructions over their shoulders about which bank, which account, how best to make the transfer to avoid extra questions. I nodded silently, seeing them to the door. When the door closed behind them, I stood for a minute in the silence, and then I returned not to the phone to call the bank. I returned to my clean, shining writing desk. Their words, "What could you possibly know?" still hung in the air. They had made a mistake. They didn't just underestimate me. They forgot who I was, and I was just starting to remember. I didn't wait until evening. Picking up the phone, I found a number in an old address book, the direct line to the lodge at Pioneer Ridge Cemetery. The rings went on for a long time. I thought no one would answer. "Hello." Ephraim's familiar low voice answered. "Ephraim, this is Eva Jones," I said. My voice did not tremble. It was the calm, business-like voice I hadn't used in 30 years. "I need to get into the crypt tonight. Can you help me?" A silence fell on the other end, not a silence of surprise, but a silence of consideration. "Yes," he replied simply. "What time?" "When the gates are closed, when no one will be here." "Good, by the side gate. I'll be waiting in 3 hours." He hung up. I put the phone down, that was it. The first step was taken. Night fell fast upon the city. I dressed entirely in black, taking with me only the toolbox wrapped in an old shawl and a small but powerful flashlight. I called a cab to the next street again. A cemetery at night is a completely different place. By day it was full of quiet sorrow. Now it was full of ringing, tense silence. The moon shone through the bare tree branches, drawing strange, skeletal shadows on the ground. By the side gate, just as he had promised, Ephraim was waiting for me. He looked like a shadow merged with the old brick wall. He silently unlocked the gate, let me in, and just as silently locked it again. We walked along the empty paths. I felt no fear. Strangely, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Here, among the dead, I felt more alive than I had in years in my museum of an apartment. We approached the Johnson crypt. In the moonlight, it looked even more massive, more foreign. Ephraim pulled out a set of keys from his pocket, not the one Jabari had. This was his work set. He didn't rush to open it. He turned to me. His face in the semi-darkness was stern and deeply sad. "Miss Jones," he began quietly, and in his voice I heard a deep, long-standing respect. "Your husband, Wami Johnson, he was more than just a man to me. A long time ago, when my family was out on the street, he was the only one who extended a hand. He paid for my education, the history department at Morehouse College. He saved us. Everything I have is thanks to him." He paused, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I've been watching your son for 6 months with disgust. I saw how he turned his father's grave into a public thoroughfare. At first, I thought it was just some of his shady dealings, but then I started listening, taking notes." He reached into his coat and pulled something out, a small, worn notebook with a dark cover. He handed it to me. "Everything is here," he said. "Dates, times of meetings, license plate numbers of the cars that came here, snippets of conversations I managed to overhear. I did it for Kame, for his memory. I didn't know what to do with it. And then yesterday you came. I took the notebook. It was heavy, not from the weight of the paper, but from the weight of the betrayal documented within its pages. I didn't open it. I just gripped it tightly in my hand. "Thank you, Ephraim," I said quietly. He nodded, and in that simple gesture, there was more understanding and alliance than I had seen in my entire life. He inserted the key into the lock. The grinding of the metal sounded like a scream. The door gave way. A smell of cold, damp, and the dust of centuries wafted out. "The spot is here," Ephraim said, pointing to one of the marble slabs on the wall to the left of the sarcophagus. It was indistinguishable from the others. "Press here and here simultaneously near the bottom. It will move." He handed me the crypt's heavy key. "Lock yourself in from the inside. I'll be nearby. When you're done, just open the door. I'll hear it." He left, dissolving into the shadows. I stepped inside, turning the massive key in the lock on the inside of the door. Click! I was alone. I switched on the flashlight. The beam of light picked out Wayne's stone sarcophagus from the darkness. Dusty, forgotten. I walked over to the wall Ephraim had indicated. I found 2 points at the bottom of the slab, barely noticeable indentations. I pressed. There was a quiet click, and the slab moved easily aside, revealing a dark niche. The hidden compartment. Carefully laid out inside were several objects wrapped in dark crimson velvet. I took one, the largest, placed it on the sarcophagus lid, and unwrapped. It was an old icon on a dark wooden board, the Savior not made by hands. The face was painted with astonishing finesse, with deep, all-forgiving sorrow in the eyes. The golden background glimmered dimly in the flashlight's beam. The varnish darkened by time. The net of perfect crackle. The tiny chips in the wood. Everything spoke of authenticity. A master's work. A true masterpiece that could grace any museum. I placed my toolbox next to it and opened it. My fingers instinctively found the familiar tools. First, the loop. I held it up to the icon. My eye, my brain, my memory, everything worked as one smooth mechanism. 30 years of inactivity vanished as if they had never been. I was myself again. I examined every millimeter, the brush strokes, the composition of the ground visible in the chips, the method of securing the splines on the reverse side. Everything was flawless, almost. I pulled out the UV lamp. In its eerie violet light, the old varnish should have given off an even yellowish green glow. It did, but when I swept the beam over the folds of the Savior's robe, in the places where the artist had used lead white to paint the light, I saw what I was looking for. There in the brightest spots, the glow was different. Brighter, colder, almost chalky. It was a tiny foreign fluorescence. The fluorescence of titanium dioxide. Its anatase form, this pigment wasn't patented until the early 20th century. To use it in an icon passed off as a 15th century work could only be done by someone absolutely confident in their genius and the buyer's blindness. A masterful forgery, brilliant, but with one tiny, arrogant mistake, a mistake that could only be made by one man. In the cold silence of the crypt, I suddenly remembered his name very clearly. The brilliant restorer who had been shamefully expelled from the National Institute of Expertise for unethical copying experiments. A man obsessed with creating the perfect fake. Anatol Voronov. I'll keep this name as he is an external character, not part of the main black family and a specialist. Often non-local specialists are hired. I knew the forger, and I knew what I had to do now. I carefully placed the icon back in the velvet, folded the tools into the box. The quiet click of the lock sounded in the dead silence like a period, marking the end of a long sentence. I returned everything to the hidden compartment, sliding the slab back into place. It settled silently, leaving no trace, as if I had never been here. I turned the key and the heavy crypt door groaned open, letting in a sliver of the night sky and a gust of fresh, cold air. Ephraim was waiting for me at the entrance like a silent guardian. I silently held out his key and the one he had given me. He took them, nodding just as silently. We didn't need words. He understood everything from my face. He turned and walked to lead me to the exit. His shadow glided ahead, pointing the way. The journey home passed like a fog. The city was beginning to wake up. Occasional cars sped through the streets. Sanitation workers cleaned the sidewalk. And I rode in the cab, clutching Ephraim's worn notebook in my pocket, feeling the icy resolve born yesterday on the hill by the old fence harden and temper inside. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling of a surgeon who makes a precise diagnosis and knows the operation will be complex but necessary. I didn't call the police. That would be too simple, too noisy, and it wouldn't restore's desecrated honor. The police would punish the criminals, but I had to destroy the lie itself, the web they had so long and so skillfully spun. And to do that, I had to strike not at their hands, but at the very center of the web. Back in the apartment, I didn't lie down. I brewed myself strong black coffee and sat down at my clean, tidy writing desk. The first rays of sun touched my window. Yesterday, the anniversary was over. A new day of action had begun. On the desk lay an old telephone directory with numbers I hadn't used for decades. I found the one I needed. Paul K. Stevens, director of the Atlanta Museum of Art. I remembered him as a young, ambitious graduate student who often visited us and looked at Kwame with reverence. The old fool, as my son had called him. I dialed the number. My fingers didn't tremble. Director's off. A cheerful woman's voice answered. Hello, please connect me with Mr. Stevens. I'm calling about an urgent matter. He's in a meeting. What is this concerning? Tell him it's Eva Jones. I'm sorry. How did you spell that? I repeated slowly, enunciating every syllable. Ava Johnson Jones, the wife of the late Com Johnson. The woman on the other end hesitated. My husband's name still carried weight in these circles. One moment, please, she said in a different, more respectful tone. I waited, listening to the wall clock tick. It was counting the seconds of my old life. Eva Johnson Jones. Paul Stevens' voice was exactly as I remembered it. Deep, slightly velvety, with notes of self-satisfaction. What a pleasant surprise. It's been so many years. Please accept my deepest condolences for your loss, dear. Wayne was a beacon for all of us. He was saying the words one is supposed to say, polite, empty. He expected me to start asking for something, complaining, reminiscing. Paul, hello, I replied calmly. I'm calling you not only as the widow of Wayne Johnson, but also as the former senior archivist of the National Institute of Expertise. A silence hung on the other end, short but very telling. The meeting apparently ended instantly. I'm listening, Eva. All the velvety condescension vanished from his voice. Weariness had replaced it. I have become aware that your museum plans to acquire a valuable exhibit soon. The 15th century Psalter, if I'm not mistaken, from a certain private collection. Silence again, longer this time. He hadn't expected that. That information is for internal use, he said cautiously. How do you have this knowledge? The source is irrelevant right now. I continued just as evenly. What matters is this. I can state with almost 100% certainty that you are being deceived. The Psalter being offered to you is a high-grade forgery, but we had experts. Panic and outrage laced his voice. The preliminary conclusion was absolutely positive. Your experts weren't looking for what they needed to look for. I hypothesized that the white pigment used to detail the initials contains the anatase form of titanium dioxide, a chemical anachronism. This pigment could not have existed in the 15th century. Check it and you will see for yourself. As I spoke, I heard my own voice from outside. It wasn't the voice of Eva the widow, Eva the mother. It was the voice of Jones, the expert who tolerates no doubt. Paul Stevens was silent. I could almost physically feel the thoughts rushing through his head. A blow to his reputation, a scandal, the loss of state funding. Titanium dioxide, he muttered as if in a daze. But who is capable of such a thing? I think you know the answer yourself, Paul, I replied, delivering the final blow. Remember who was expelled from the Institute about 20 years ago for handling copies too loosely. Remember Anatol Voronov? That name acted like an electric shock. Voronov, God, I thought he drank himself to death somewhere. As you can see now, his talent has found a new application. Paul, I strongly urge you to immediately stop the deal and conduct a full independent forensic analysis before it's too late. Yes, of course, Eva. I am in your debt. I will cancel everything immediately. We must meet later. I interrupted him. First, do what you must. Goodbye, I hung up. The apartment was quiet again, but the silence was different. It no longer oppressed me. It hummed with tension like a taut string. I knew that right now in the museum director's office, phones were ringing, orders were being given, and the nearly signed contract was flying into the waste basket. I pictured Jabari's face when the buyer called him. I pictured Niara's panic when they realized that their biggest score, the very money they were supposed to use to pay off their unreliable partners, had vanished, turned into smoke. I stood up and went to the window. The day was breaking. Their easy money was gone. Their creditors, I was certain, don't like to wait. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Now it was counting down to the explosion. I intended to wait for it right here on my staging ground in complete tranquility. 2 days passed. 2 days of deafening, tense silence. They didn't call. They didn't come. I knew this was the calm before the storm. They were trying to figure out what had happened, trying to salvage their deal to contact their accomplices. But I had cut the main thread in their web, and now the whole structure was collapsing, burying them beneath it. I wasn't idle. I dedicated these 2 days to reorganization. With the help of Ephraim, who came to check on me under the pretense of fixing a leaky faucet, I carried out a small revolution in my apartment. We moved Wami's massive oak desk against the wall. It was no longer the center of this universe. It became just a piece of furniture. And in the center of the living room, in the spot where my husband's desk had reigned, I placed my writing desk, my small, modest, but now shining clean workspace. I brought the books that had been gathering dust on the shelves from my bedroom. My books, the very monographs and reference guides. I spread them out around me on the desk, on the chairs. I took out Ephraim's notebook and began making notes on a large sheet of butcher paper. License plate numbers, dates, names I managed to decipher. What emerged was a diagram, a map of their criminal life. For the first time in years, this apartment stopped being a mausoleum and started looking like an office. My office. On the third day they came, I knew it was them even before the knock. More accurately, it wasn't a knock. It was a furious, broken pounding. They were hitting the door with their fists. I didn't rush. I carefully put down my pen and closed the notebook. I stood up and walked slowly to the door. The sound of the blows grew louder. Jabari's voice, distorted by rage, was added to it. "Mom, open up. I know you're home. Open it right now." I turned the key in the lock. The door flew open so abruptly that it hit the wall. They burst into the hallway like two predators. Their faces were distorted by a mix of fear and hatred. Yesterday's condescension, the day before's fake sorrow. All of it peeled away like cheap gold plating, revealing an ugly, greedy core. "What have you done?" Jabari roared, advancing on me. His eyes were red, crazed. "What did you say to who? The deal is off. We've been burned. The buyer is gone. It was you. You ruined everything. You destroyed us." He yelled, spitting saliva. Before, I would have cringed in fear, burst into tears, and started justifying myself. But now I simply stood and looked at him calmly, like a doctor looking at a patient having a fit. I silently turned and walked back into the living room. I sat down at my desk and picked up my pen. He followed me, never stopping his shouting. "I'm talking to you. Look at me." I dipped the pen into the inkwell and wrote down another license plate number from Ephraim's notebook on the paper. I didn't look at him. "Destroyed you?" I asked quietly, not lifting my gaze from the paper. My voice in the middle of his hysteria sounded deafeningly calm. "Or exposed you?" Jabari fell silent for a moment, thrown off by my tone. What are you saying? What exposure? Have you lost your mind, old woman?" "I'm merely consulting," I continued just as quietly, drawing a line from the license plate number to the date of the meeting. "Imagine the museum finds my old hobbies very valuable, much more valuable than your import-export." And then I looked up at them. I looked first at Jabari, then at Niara. I watched as the realization dawned on them as disbelief in their eyes turned to horror. They looked at me and didn't see their quiet, harmless Senel mother or an accessory to the apartment and the pension. They saw a woman sitting at her working desk in the center of the room. A woman with a straight back and a cold, clear, absolutely calm gaze. The gaze of an expert delivering a final verdict. They saw Ava Jones, the archavist, whom they had buried and forgotten 30 years ago. "You!" Jabari whispered. He took a step back. All his fury had drained away, leaving behind only sticky primal. "You called the museum." I didn't answer. I just looked at him. "You used his grave as a warehouse, Jabari," I said, and my voice, though quiet, filled the entire room. There was no pity in it, only a statement of fact. "You traded in forgeries from your father's crypt. You dragged his name, his legacy, his whole life through the mud for money." I paused, letting the words soak into the silence. There is nothing left to destroy here. These words hung in the air, final and inevitable, like a sentence. Jabari looked at me, and there was no more rage in his eyes, only empty, childlike terror. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish thrown onto the bank, but couldn't utter a sound. He looked for salvation, for support, but turning to his wife, he saw only cold, calculated pain. Nara had already regained her composure. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something else. A nasty, venomous resolve. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me, already calculating her next move. She grabbed Jabari's arm, her fingers dug into his sleeve. "Let's go," she hit. "It's useless to talk to her. She's not right in the head." She dragged him toward the exit. He walked stumbling, his glazed eyes fixed on me. Before disappearing behind the door, Niara turned around, and in her glare, I read everything. "This isn't over. This is a declaration of war." They left. I remained sitting at my desk in the silence that followed. I knew Niara wouldn't give up. Like a wounded snake, she would writhe and strike until the end. I had to wait for her blow, and it followed 2 days later. My neighbor, Ms. Anime, called me. Her voice trembled with outrage. "Eva, did you see tonight's gossip hound? Sit down before you read it." I didn't subscribe to the tabloids. I went to the convenience store and bought the cheap, foul-smelling sheet. And on page 3, beneath the screaming headline, Widow's Grief or Senior Insanity, I saw my pic, an old one taken about 10 years ago at some anniversary. Next to it was a photo of Jabari and Niara posing as a loving, suffering couple. The article was a masterpiece of lies and manipulation. An anonymous source close to the family recounted a heartbreaking story. How the poor widow of the great academic Kwame Johnson, Eva Johnson Jones, had never recovered after her husband's death. How she had retreated into herself, started rambling, confusing reality with fiction, and how, in her deranged state, she had invented a monstrous story to blacken the name of her only son and his wife, who were dedicated to her care. There were hints that I might have even connected with some con artists myself, and was now confused, trying to shift the blame onto my children. The final chord was especially vile. It's possible the elderly woman obsessed with antiques is herself the mastermind of a criminal ring, and her accusation is merely a way to eliminate competitors or ease her own cons. This was their last desperate move to make me look crazy, to discredit me in the eyes of anyone who might believe me. They struck at my weakest point. My age, my loneliness. The calculation was simple. Who would believe an old, heartbroken widow over a successful young couple? I finished the article, folded the newspaper, and felt nothing. No offense, no anger, just cold contempt. They thought they were playing chess, but in reality they had just overturned the board and by doing so signed their final sentence. I dialed Paul Stevens' number, museum director speaking. Paul, it's Eva Jones. Did you read tonight's Gossip Hound? A heavy sigh came from the other end. I did, Eva. What garbage? I was just about to call my lawyers. Your lawyers won't be necessary. I interrupted him. I have a better idea. I think it's time for the museum to announce its new acquisition. Not the Psalter, but something much more valuable. An hour later, I was in the director's office. Ephraim's notebook lay on the table before me. Paul, and the museum security chief leaned over. I calmly and methodically explained what each entry, each date, and each license plate number meant. I showed them my diagram. I talked about the chemical composition of pigments, the techniques for artificially aging wood, and the forging of watermarks on paper. I spoke, and they listened, their faces growing more serious. There was no more condescension in the director's eyes. There was respect, and the eagerness of a professional who has scented a major prize. They declared war, he said, closing the notebook. So they'll get one. Tomorrow, 11:00 a.m. in the museum's large conference room. We are calling a press conference. The next day, the hall was packed. Journalists from every major publication, television cameras, camera flashes, a buzzing hive, anticipating a scandal. I sat in the first row. Ephraim sat next to me, dressed in a plain, though well-maintained suit. He was as calm as a rock. Paul Stevens walked up to the podium. He looked imposing and authoritative. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming, he began. The museum has called you together today for a very important reason. As you know, our primary mission is the preservation of cultural heritage. And today we want to announce a new vital step in this direction. He paused. We are introducing a new position to our staff, special consultant for antiquities and authenticity. It is with immense honor that I introduce the person who will hold this, a person whose name is synonymous with impeccable reputation and the highest level of professionalism in this. Please welcome Eva Johnson. He turned and looked at me. Silence hung in the hall for a second, followed by sparse, confused applause. Journalists exchanged glances. The author of yesterday's Gossip Hound article dropped their pen. I stood up and walked to the podium. I looked out at the hall, at the camera flashes, at the dozens of curious eyes, and began to speak calmly, clearly, without notes. I told them about titanium dioxide, about the difference in the glow of old and new varnish under ultraviolet light. I spoke not as a victim or a crazy old woman. I spoke as an expert giving a lecture. The hall fell silent. They listened, holding their breath. And now, I said at the end, I would like you to hear from the man whose courage and dedication to my husband's memory helped prevent a major theft from the public purse. Ephraim walked up to the podium. He placed his worn notebook upon. I just did what I had to do, he said quietly but firmly. At that very moment, while the cameras were focused on Ephraim's notebook on the other side of the city, two unmarked cars pulled up to the home of my son and his wife. They were just finishing packing their bags. The door was
I cut
opened
into
for
the
them,
tough
not by them. The door was opened with a detective's key. When the press conference ended, Paul's assistant approached me. "Miss Jones," he whispered. "We just got word they were apprehended attempting to flee." I heard those words. They were apprehended and felt nothing resembling triumph. There was no joy, no glee. There was only silence, a deep, deafening silence that followed a very long, exhausting noise. I slowly nodded to the assistant, accepting the news as a given, like a doctor's conclusion. Paul immediately stepped between me and the journalists who were closing in with new questions. "That's all for today, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you." His voice sounded like a gavel closing an auction. He took my arm and, ignoring the murmuring, led me through the service
Not the
exit
woman
away
who'd
from the
once rocked
chaos.
half the people
From
in
that
that
day
room to
on, my
sleep.
life changed. More
I
accurately,
cut
it
into
didn't
the tough
change. It
Not the
began.
woman
The
who'd
first thing
once
I did
rocked
upon
half the
returning
people in that
home was
room to
throw
sleep.
open all the windows wide.
I
I
cut
took
into
down
the
the
tough
heavy, dusty
Not
drapes
the
that had
woman
hung
who'd
there for
once rocked
decades,
half the people
letting
in
the
that room
sun
to
and
sleep.
air into the apartment.
I
The
cut into the
rooms
tough
filled with light,
Not
and
the
it
woman
turned
who'd
out they
once
weren't
rocked
so
half the
gloomy
people in
after
that
all.
room to
The
sleep.
dust dancing in the
I
sunbeams
cut
no
into the
longer
tough
seemed like a
Not the
symbol of
woman who'd
oblivion.
once
Now
rocked
it was
half the
just
people in
dust
that
that
room to
needed to be
sleep.
wiped away. The
I
apartment
cut into the
transformed.
tough
It ceased to be a
Not the woman who'd
mausoleum for
once
one
rocked
great
half the
man.
people
It
in that
became a
room to
living
sleep.
workspace for another.
I cut
Wayne's
into the
books
tough
still stood on the
Not the
shelves,
woman who'd
but
once
now
rocked
mine
half the
appeared
people in that
beside.
room to
On his
sleep.
desk, which I left by the
I
wall
cut
as a
into the
tribute,
tough
there was now a vase
Not
of
the
fresh
woman who'd once
flowers,
rocked half
not
the
stacks
people
of
in
old
that room to sleep.
manuscripts, and my writing desk
I
in the
cut
center
into
of the
the
room
tough
hummed with a
Not the
quiet,
woman who'd
active light.
once
It
rocked
was
half the
cluttered with
people in that
books,
room to sleep.
printouts, and photographs of
I
antiques
cut
sent for
into the tough
appraisal from all over the
Not the
country.
woman who'd
The air
once
no
rocked
longer
half the
smelled of
people in that
tobacco
room
and
to
decay.
sleep.
It smelled of lemon
I cut
polish,
into the
freshly
tough
brewed
Not
coffee,
the
and the
woman who'd
printer's
once
ink of
rocked
new
half the
catalog,
people in
the
that room
sound
to
of the
sleep.
phone ringing. I was sitting at the
I cut
desk,
into the tough
examining a photograph
Not
of
the
an
woman who'd
enameled
once
locket with
rocked
my
half
loop.
the
The
people in
phone
that room
rang,
to sleep.
sharp and demanding. I
I
picked up the
cut into the
receiver
tough
without taking my
Not the
eyes off
woman
the
who'd
intricate
once
pattern.
rocked half the
Jones.
people in that room to
"Hello, Ms.
sleep.
Jones. This is the
I
Legacy
cut
Auction
into the
House.
tough
We're calling about
Not
that
the woman
Fabra
who'd
cigarette
once rocked
case.
half the
We have
people in that room
documents
to sleep.
confirming the provenance. Very
I cut
solid
into the
paperwork."
tough
I chuckled to myself. Paperwork is the easiest thing to fake. "Is the master's hallmark authentic?" I asked. "Absolutely perfect." "It's too perfect, young man," I replied, pushing the photograph aside. My voice was calm and firm. Carl Faber had an apprentice during that period with a slight vision defect. He always set the hallmark, slightly tilting it to the right by fractions of a millimeter. Yours is set as if by a ruler. It's modern work done using old sketches. Very good work, but work nonetheless. "No, the provenance is fake. Tell your client just that." A stunned silence hung on the other end. "I've said my piece." I hung up the phone and picked up the loop again. Twice a week, I led seminars at the Museum for Young Curators for art history students. I stood in the bright, spacious
Not the
hall
woman
before a
who'd once
dozen young
rocked half the
faces,
people in
hungry
that
for
room to
knowledge.
sleep.
They looked at me not as an
I cut
elderly
into the
woman,
tough
but as a source of
Not the
knowledge that
woman
couldn't
who'd
be
once
read in
rocked
any
half the
text. They
people in
hung
that
on my
room to
every
sleep.
word. Never trust first
I cut into
impressions,
the
I
tough
told them, holding an
Not the
ancient
woman who'd
riaque.
once rocked
Beauty can
half the
lie,
people in that
history
room to
can
sleep.
lie. Even science can be
I
used to
cut into
lie.
the
But the
tough
object
Not the
itself, the
woman
thing
who'd
never
once rocked
lies. You
half
just
the
have to
people in
learn
that
to
room to
listen to
sleep.
its quiet voice. Look here
I
at the
cut into the
scroll
tough
work. Do you see how the
Not the
light
woman
plays
who'd
on the
once
patina?
rocked half
It
the
lies
people in
too
that room to
evenly.
sleep.
Real time is merciless.
I
It
cut
leaves
into the tough
scars where
Not the
traces of
woman
human
who'd once
touch.
rocked
And
half
here
the
there is
people in
only
that
the
room to sleep.
flawless work of a chemist. I looked at their
I cut
shining
into the tough
eyes and understood this
Not the
was it.
woman who'd
This was
once
the true
rocked half the
legacy.
people
Not
in
in
that room to
granite and
sleep.
marble, but in this
I
transmission
cut
of
into the
knowledge,
tough
in this spark of
Not the
love for
woman who'd once
authenticity that
rocked
I was
half the
igniting
people
in me,
in that
just
room
as
to
Scum
sleep.
had once ignited it in me.
I
Today,
cut
after
into the
the
tough
seminar, I didn't go
Not the
straight
woman
home.
who'd
The
once
day was
rocked half the
surprisingly
people in that
warm and
room to
sunny.
sleep.
I bought a bouquet of white
I cut
leaves and
into the
drove
tough
to Pioneerage Cemetery. Everything here was different, too. Sunlight broke through the foliage, and the shadows no longer seemed sinister. They simply offered coolness. I walked along the familiar path, and my heart was quiet and peaceful. I approached our crypt. The granite door was closed forever. I knew that everything inside had been set in order now. There were no more hidden compartments, no more dirty, foreign objects, only peace. I placed the flowers on the cold stone. The white leaves stood out brightly against the dark granite. I ran my palm over the engraved letters. Quam Johnson. And I didn't feel the sharp cutting pain that had haunted me all those years. Only a gentle, quiet sadness and gratitude remained. "Well, calm," I whispered. "Everything is right now. Everything is in its place." I stood for a little longer, inhaling the scent of the flowers and the decaying leaves. I was here not as a widow who had come to mourn her loss. I was here as a woman who had reclaimed her name, her dignity, and her future. Turning to leave, I saw Ephra's figure in the distance at the turn of the path. He was sweeping the driveway. He saw me, stopped, and simply nodded once, solemnly and respectfully. I nodded back at him. It was our silent salute, the salute of two custodians. I walked toward the exit, the sun shining on my back. I was no longer the shadow of my great husband. I was not the mother of my fallen son. I was Eva Jones, and my liberation was complete. And so the story of Eva Jones comes to an end. The story of a quiet woman who was ignored for decades by the people closest to her, who took her love and self-sacrifice for granted. This is a tale not only of a terrible betrayal, but also of incredible inner strength that, like an old tool that hasn't lost its power, can be brought back to life. Eva found the courage not just to punish the guilty, but to completely reconstruct her own life, reclaiming her name, respect, and right to a future. Her story is a reminder that it's never too late to remember who you truly are, but her choice was incredibly difficult. Do you think she did the right thing by handing her own son over to justice? Was it cold revenge? Or was it the only correct way to protect her husband's legacy and her own honor? Could she, as a mother, have found another path, tried to forgive or save him differently? And would you like to know what happened to Eva next? How did her new career unfold? And did Jabari ever try to contact her after everything that happened? Your thoughts are very important to us. If you have any questions about this story or are simply curious about any details that remained off camera, please write about them in the comments. Please like this video if the story touched you and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new captivating stories. Your feedback is the best reward for our work. We wish you all the best. Did you like this story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.
I cut into the tough not the woman who'd once rocked half the people in that room to sleep. I cut